The system presents a visible pattern. Students commit earlier and earlier to continuation tracks, even when better options may emerge later. What appears to be a flexible academic pathway gradually behaves like a pre-booked pipeline, where movement becomes constrained long before decisions are finalized. A common explanation suggests that students simply prefer stability and continuity in their academic path. Early commitment is interpreted as a rational preference for certainty over uncertainty, especially when future opportunities are unclear. Under this view, renewal systems are seen as protective structures. They allow students to secure their position in advance, reducing risk and preserving access to institutional resources. But this explanation breaks when timing patterns are examined. Students begin committing before meaningful information about future performance, opportunities, or alternatives becomes available, indicating a shift driven by something other than preference for certainty. The behavior is not evenly distributed across decision windows. Instead, commitments cluster earlier over time, suggesting that the timing itself has become a strategic variable rather than a passive choice. What appears as a preference for stability fails to explain why delaying a decision increasingly carries disproportionate cost. The system begins to penalize waiting, even when waiting would produce better-informed decisions. The underlying structure reveals a continuity-based reservation rule. Access to future slots is tied to maintaining eligibility through early renewal, creating a conditional pathway that rewards commitment before full evaluation. This transforms continuation from a neutral option into a scarce resource. Slots are not simply allocated based on performance, but are pre-claimed through timing, shifting competition toward early positioning. Students adapt by locking in earlier than necessary. The decision is no longer about selecting the best option, but about avoiding exclusion from the continuation pool. As more participants adopt this strategy, available capacity begins to compress earlier in the cycle. Late-stage flexibility diminishes as fewer unreserved slots remain open for adjustment. The system now exhibits capacity preemption. Future access is effectively decided in advance, before the conditions that would normally inform those decisions have fully materialized. This creates a coordination shift across participants. Each individual move to commit earlier increases the pressure on others to do the same, accelerating the overall timeline. The signal of renewal begins to diverge from its intended function. Instead of indicating sustained qualification, it becomes a mechanism for securing position ahead of others. Eligibility retention becomes the dominant objective. Maintaining access takes priority over optimizing outcomes, narrowing the decision space for all participants. A contrast emerges between the system's stated purpose and its operational behavior. What is framed as continuity support functions as a timing-based allocation mechanism. This reframes early commitment as a defensive move rather than a preference-driven choice. Actors respond to the risk of slot loss, not to the intrinsic value of continuity itself. As commitments accumulate, the system stabilizes into a new pattern. Most positions are reserved before late-stage evaluation, making subsequent decision points largely symbolic. Late entrants face structurally reduced access. Even with stronger qualifications, their options are constrained by earlier reservation dynamics. The system no longer reallocates based on updated information. Instead, it preserves earlier commitments, reinforcing the advantage of early positioning. This locks the system into a reservation-first logic. Continuation pathways are secured through timing rather than reassessed through performance. The original promise of protection remains visible, but beneath it, access is increasingly determined by when commitment occurs, not by what the eventual conditions justify. The result is a stabilized equilibrium where early commitment dominates behavior. Future flexibility is systematically reduced, and the system operates as a preemptive allocation structure rather than a responsive one. Once early reservation becomes the dominant strategy, the timing of commitment begins to decouple from the timing of information. Decisions are made before relevant performance signals fully materialize, creating a persistent mismatch between when choices are locked and when outcomes are known. This mismatch shifts the role of evaluation itself. Assessment no longer determines access, but instead operates after access has already been secured, reducing its influence on actual allocation. As a result, later information loses its capacity to reallocate positions. Even when new data suggests better alternatives, the system cannot respond without disrupting previously locked commitments. The system begins to accumulate locked-in positions that were chosen under incomplete information. These positions persist not because they remain optimal, but because reversing them carries higher coordination cost than maintaining them. This creates a feedback loop between early commitment and reduced adaptability. Each additional early reservation increases the cost of future adjustment, making the system progressively less responsive to new conditions. Information asymmetry starts to widen across participants. Those who commit early operate under limited visibility, while those who delay face reduced access, creating a trade-off between information quality and positional security. Over time, the value of information declines relative to the value of timing. Actors begin to prioritize securing position over acquiring better data, reinforcing the shift away from informed decision-making. This changes how signals are interpreted within the system. Eligibility status becomes a proxy for access rather than a reflection of current qualification, distorting the meaning of the signal itself. As more capacity is preempted, late-stage options compress further. The system effectively reallocates opportunity from evaluation-based distribution to reservation-based distribution. The feedback loop intensifies as each cycle repeats. Earlier commitments in one cycle shift expectations in the next, pushing participants to move even sooner to avoid exclusion. At scale, the system begins to operate ahead of its own timeline. Decisions that were once made at a certain stage are now made earlier, not because conditions have changed, but because the cost of waiting has increased. This creates a self-reinforcing acceleration dynamic. The anticipation of future congestion drives earlier action, which in turn produces the congestion being anticipated. The coordination structure shifts from reactive to anticipatory behavior. Participants act based on expected system states rather than current conditions, further weakening the link between decisions and real-time information. However, it becomes unclear whether the system could stabilize without this early commitment pattern. If participants delayed, capacity might reopen for flexible allocation, but the risk of exclusion prevents any individual from testing that alternative. This introduces a structural rigidity that cannot be resolved at the individual level. Each actor's rational move reinforces the collective constraint, making deviation increasingly costly. Over time, the system's equilibrium becomes path-dependent. Current allocation patterns are determined less by present conditions and more by accumulated prior commitments. This locks the system into a reservation-first continuity equilibrium. Access is preserved through timing alignment, while adaptability and reallocation capacity continue to erode with each cycle. The system now rewards timing over evaluation. Early commitment secures access regardless of later information, while decisions made after full visibility carry diminishing value. What was previously a flexible allocation process becomes a front-loaded reservation system. Opportunities are distributed based on when actors commit, not on how conditions evolve, narrowing the role of performance in determining outcomes. Waiting becomes structurally penalized. Delaying a decision increases the risk of exclusion, even if it improves decision quality, pushing behavior toward earlier and earlier commitment. At the same time, maintaining eligibility becomes the central constraint. Actors organize around preserving their position within the system rather than optimizing across alternatives, reinforcing continuity over adaptability. The equilibrium stabilizes around preemptive allocation. Access is secured through early reservation, while late-stage adjustments lose relevance, locking the system into a pattern where behavior aligns with timing incentives rather than underlying conditions.